This is important, I really think, because Dr. Ortlund says that in the pre-Nicene period, one of the things that distinguishes Christians from pagans, and one of the reasons that pagans criticize Christians, is that, in his presentation of the history, Christians do not have images and pagans do. However, if this was a widely recognized point of distinction which set paganism and Christianity apart, why are the pagan emperors targeting Christian images? And if this is a controversial practice, which is accreted from a paganism, I want to know where the controversy is. Hi, everyone. This is Sarah from Hamilton, and I'm very excited today to return to an issue that my friend Michael and I talked about quite a bit last year, and that was Gavin Ortlund's presentation on iconography before the Second Council of Nicaea. So if you're not familiar with this controversy, the controversy began when Dr. Ortlund made a very strong set of claims, which is that the theology expressed by the Second Council of Nicaea was not just ambiguously supported in the early centuries of the church. It wasn't just that there are a few passages here and there, or even a lot of passages, which seem to press against it. It was that there's unambiguously no evidence to support the early creation and veneration of icons in the pre-Nicene period. Moreover, Dr. Ortlund presented a very specific thesis, and that thesis was that the earliest period in which we can say that the cult of images developed in any way resembling Second Nicaea was in the 500 AD. And to his credit, he cited a number of scholars who support his broad thesis on those claims. But I invited Michael Garten on the channel to do a series of presentations arguing that Dr. Ortlund's presentation was at best too simple and at worst actively misleading in key ways, though of course not by intention. So I'm very happy to welcome Michael back on the channel in order to respond to a video presentation that Dr. Ortlund did in response to one of our videos, though we did several videos which expanded on the arguments we initially developed, and Dr. Ortlund did not engage those. So welcome back to the channel, Michael.
Hey, Seraphim. Thanks for having me on again. It's good to team up with you once more. Yeah, I think that we've got some exciting stuff to share with people today.
Yeah.
And let's get right on to it.
Yeah, one of the things that I want to say up front, Dr. Ortlund is a cordial guy. We're not trying to apply any dishonesty on his part, but he tried to speak very clearly and very directly to us in his video, and we appreciate that. We want direct engagement. We want people to say what they mean. We don't have to dance around our very strong disagreements and the degree to which we're convinced of the soundness of our arguments. However, I want to say, in the same vein, that Dr. Ortlund's thesis that the creation and veneration of icons can at the earliest period be dated to the 500s AD is not just open to question. It is abjectly false. There was a recent article that was translated by a Russian theologian and scholar named Peter Pashkov, and he cites just one example that I just want to bring to everyone's attention, because this alone should really settle the issue as to at what point in history we find meaningful precedent to the Second Council of Nicaea. And this is a passage in St. Gregory of Nissa. St. Gregory of Nissa is one of the Cappadocian fathers, one of the great theologians who developed and defended the doctrine of the Trinity. And St. Gregory of Nissa describes what the church in the 4th century, so soon after the Council of Nicaea, but he describes what it looked like. He says this: should a person come to a place similar to our assembly today, where the memory of the just and the rest of the saints is present, first, consider this house's great dignity to which souls are led. God's temple is brightly adorned with magnificence and is embellished with decorations, pictures of animals which masons have fashioned with delicate silver figures. It exhibits images of flowers made in the likeness of the martyr's virtues, his struggles, his sufferings, the various savage actions of tyrants, assaults, that fiery furnace, the athlete's blessed consummation, and the human form of Christ presiding over all these events. They are like a book skillfully interpreting by means of colors which express the martyr's struggles and glorify the temple with resplendent beauty. The pictures located on the walls are eloquent by their silence and offer significant testimony. Now, what I want to point out about this description is that St. Gregory of Nissa is describing what a church building in his own time and place looked like. And he's describing the way that a particular martyr was venerated. And the description that he presents should be familiar to anybody who's been inside a number of Orthodox churches. We have an icon which depicts the events in the life of the saint with the human form of Christ overlooking the series of events. And this is remarkable because it's not just a superficial parallel to the later Christian veneration of images. We find here that a particular saint is being venerated by having his life depicted, and the depiction of his life in visible form is put in a significant place in the building of the church. Now, whenever you're dealing with archaeological evidence or the construction of a church building, or the significance of images, you're going to have to derive a lot of information from the place that the image is put in the building. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to dig deeper into the questions that Dr. Ortlund raised about our presentation. We're going to reiterate some of the evidence that he did not address at all, and we are going to respond in more detail to his arguments against the presence of early iconography. So, Michael, thank you so much for coming on, and I'm excited for what we have today.
And I just want to reiterate that article by Peter Pashkov is quite significant. I really recommend that people find it. Peter Pashkov, I don't remember the exact title, but if you type in Peter Pashkov icon veneration,
I'll have a link to it.
Yeah, that sounds good. There's definitely some pre-Nicene evidence in there that I think people need to consider and look at, that shows certain kinds of precedent, certain kinds of early Christian holy images being attested to in the textual record. I'm going to bring up, I think, maybe one example from his article today when talking about Tertullian, but there's a lot of stuff there. And I think it needs to be considered as kind of a parallel case that went in a little bit of a different direction from ours. But
And one of the things that we should also address up front is that what I expect Dr. Ortlund and those who support his presentation to say here is that these passages describe the creation of images, but not their veneration. Now, we can respond to that in multiple directions. We can say that veneration is implied by the position of the image in the church and so on and so forth. But I also want to point out that Dr. Ortlund's initial presentation is much stronger than that particular claim, that early Christians were okay with making images, but not venerating them. In the construction of early Christian history that Dr. Ortlund presented, he cited a number of passages which he interpreted to be a blanket prohibition on even the creation of images of any kind in the church building. He cited passages which he interpreted to mean that there was no statuary or no icons that were even present or allowed in the church at this time. And he interpreted these passages to imply that taboo on this practice was sufficiently strong that it was only really overcome at the earliest by the 500s AD and probably later than that. And so I think that there's a little bit of a problem here in that Dr. Ortlund isn't really clear on what precisely his thesis is, because sometimes it seems to move around to, okay, they made images, but they didn't venerate them. And sometimes the passages he's citing are being interpreted to imply that they didn't even make images. So in order to really engage in depth, I think we would invite Dr. Ortlund to clarify the exact extent of his thesis and then to develop his arguments in a way that supports that particular thesis rather than allowing it to slip around, as I think, with all respect, it really did.
And let me just add in that you have to make all of the ante-Nicene evidence, you have to make each of the evidences talk to each other and see how it is possible for them to all hang together and for all the claims made to be kind of coherent and consistent with each other. It's okay to say that some ante-Nicene authors erred and were contradicted by others.
Sure.
But if you have a bunch of ante-Nicene authors who seem to be saying no images, and you have other ante-Nicene authors very clearly attesting to images, you then have to ask, like, well, what did they mean by no images? And just being like, well, they just said no images. We can't be contented to leave it at that. We have to then ask, well, which kinds of images were they talking about? The context in these no image quotes, of course, typically has very strong indicators that it's referring to animated statuary or idols, as they're more commonly called, which Christians have never adopted or used. And so that is, of course, my interpretation. That's the interpretation of several other. There are plenty of Catholic apologetics videos online that did a great job of bringing out this fact as well. But the point is, you have to make the ante-Nicene sources talk to each other, and if they seem to be saying contradictory things, you have to start wondering what is specifically meant by phrases like no images.
Right. So, and this is another important point, that Gavin is not just citing authors whom he interprets to say, I don't like images. Yeah. He's citing authors for the value of their historical testimony that none of our churches have images in them. And then when you dig up churches from the ante-Nicene period and you see lots of imagery, that raises questions as to how we should be interpreting this evidence. So this is a question which is raised by the nature of the evidence itself. It is not raised by an ad hoc necessity of an Orthodox or a Catholic apologist to make Second Nicaea work in view of what he takes to be very clear pieces of data. And frankly, this is something that all Christians have to do in relation to our sources of revelation, whatever we identify those as, right? Like Scripture has passages which seem to be extremely clearly contradicting other passages. Now, I don't think they in fact do contradict each other, but plenty of atheists out there are going to snort and say, oh, this is ridiculous. It's just so obvious that they contradict each other. And there's some force to that, because you really have to say, you have to have some kind of patience and wait to see the logic unfold and develop and work through these issues. And Dr. Ortlund has raised passages which, are genuinely significant. They do sound iconoclastic. We're not minimizing that point. But we want to say this is a much more complicated issue, and there is a lot of evidence which, at the very least, unambiguously demonstrates that the simple thesis Dr. Ortlund presented about the absence of icon veneration in the early centuries does not work. If he wants to present a thesis analogous to that, it needs to be restricted and clarified in a way that is consonant with the evidence.
Yeah.
So you ready to get into the weeds here?
Definitely.
All right.
Yeah. All right, so this is primarily a reply to Dr. Ortlund's May 20, 2024 video. You'll see the thumbnail there with Seraphim himself on it. And
a very flattering picture of me.
And this video that Dr. Ortlund did, it's primarily a critique of the positive case that we put forward for the veneration of images being present in 5 ante-Nicene written sources. We really haven't been talking very much about that other thing that we were just referring to, namely this question of how to interpret the apparently aniconic passages, just because there's actually a lot of videos out there that handle that quite well. We were specifically wanting to focus on positive case, which is more, shall we say, neglected, or it's not stated as much online. Now, before we even get started with the actual evidence itself, I want to announce, I'm very excited about this, the publication of my book, Early Icons, Christian Image Veneration Before 325 AD. This is volume 1 coming to you, Written Evidence and Paintings. And just as a little preview into what's there, what I do is give an extensive case for image veneration in the first 300 years of the church. I show 14 passages in pre-Nicene Christian texts that attest to image veneration or the use of holy images. I talk about 3 categories of pre-Nicene Christian paintings that were venerated. There's numerous instances in there, but 3 categories of paintings. I give evidence for cultic commemoration through images, praying through images, viewing them to focus worship on God, exalting or elevating images, and other acts of honor in the first 300 years. And I showed 10 scholars who acknowledge evidence of early veneration directly and indirectly. So I think this book is going to be very timely for people that are interested in this issue. I think it will be a wonderful resource for the Orthodox, and for those who are kind of trying to sort through these issues. This is something to reference as a point of challenge, something that could maybe make you reconsider some of your notions about this question. I think a lot of people will pick this up and they'll walk away from it saying, okay, there's definitely some evidence, at least, of image veneration being present before 325 AD among normal Christians, among typical Orthodox Christians.
And I think one of the things that you draw out, both in these videos and in the book, is that Dr. Ortlund has unintentionally, no doubt, misrepresented the nature of the academic discussion on this subject. He's not misquoted, for the most part, the scholars whom he has cited. Yes, there are scholars who do date the development of image veneration very late, but academic discussion has moved on this question as it's taken into account new kinds of evidence. And in fact, there is significant scholarly discussion today about the degree to which image veneration goes back much further than the 500s AD.
Yes, that is true. That is true. And I think that there's also, this is something that I'll talk about a little more in the conclusion, but I think there's a difference between different kinds of scholars and who we use as a point of reference for this kind of information. A lot of the scholars that Dr. Ortlund relies on are historians of kind of the transitional period between, shall we say, early Byzantine history and middle Byzantine history. So like around the 600s, 700s, early 800s, as you're transferring into the middle phase of Byzantine history there. But the topic about which we're talking here is late antiquity. We're talking about before the Byzantine Empire. And so it's very important to be interfacing a lot with specialists who are talking about early Christian art and material culture, who are talking about pre-Nicene discoveries in archaeology. What does the textual record also reflect about the kind of material culture that pre-Nicene Christians had? And I'm not saying Dr. Ortlund doesn't reference any scholars like that. For instance, Dr. Robin Jensen, she is a scholar of early Christian art and early, pre-Nicene material culture to some extent. But that's one scholar, and her own views actually in some places do lend towards image veneration, even though she doesn't use that terminology all the time. There is a passage where she acknowledges that image veneration could have been very well present at the Dura Europos church, which was constructed and then destroyed, unfortunately, well before the 300s. But the point is, it's really important to be interfacing with scholars who are actually talking about this, who are specialists in this time period, referencing what they have to say about it. Not that the Byzantine historians don't have anything valid to say, but if you're looking for maximal precision, the most updated discussion on these things, that's where you would go. All right, so that's a brief note about this book. I hope everyone will consider it. This book will be available for purchase this month. This book is available for purchase next month, and it's going to be a game changer for conversation about this issue. So first, we want to preview our case. So essentially, in our response to Dr. Ortlund, what we're going to be putting forward is that Christians adopted specifically honorable, that is to say, venerated types of images from their surrounding Roman culture. They baptized certain image types that were just very distinctly the image types that got venerated. We're going to show that for St. Ignatius of Antioch, the cross of Christ is identified by him as a standard, likely a trophy battle standard, that the cross is exalted by St. Ignatius in how he, in the way that he speaks about it, he's clearly showing a gesture of honor towards it, and also that he indicates the presence of images of the cross in churches. With respect to Clement, we're going to show that the signet images that he refers to have an extremely high level of significance, power, authority, and status, that they were seen as honorable image types. Additionally, I'm going to respond to more of what Dr. Ortlund has to say about Clement, but I'm going to also introduce some new evidence of a specific gesture of veneration that Clement himself references in his text, the Logos Pedagogos, or the instructor. With Origen, we're going to talk about how he actually has a passage where he honors the imperial image, where he talks about the veneration of portraits of the emperor. This, I think, will reset the conversation about whether Origen is an aniconist. We'll also talk about his teaching about the iconic quality of Christian altars, and we will vindicate the claim that he describes the veneration of these iconic objects, namely altars. With regard to Tertullian, we're going to discuss the chalice images of the Good Shepherd that he speaks of. We're going to show that these are actually a conduit of worship that Christians had to honorably interact with in order to route that worship, that Eucharistic worship, to God. With respect to St. Methodius, we will show that for him, the images of God's angels, which Christians craft out of gold that he references, that these images were honored, that's what he's saying. And I want to, in saying all this, I don't want our listeners and viewers to lose sight of the fact that this is one of 5 or 6 pillars in a cumulative case. And so before we start talking about Dr. Ortlund's objections, this is important to consider. Originally, what we had presented was not just written evidence. It was 5 categories of evidence. The written evidence from pre-325 AD Christian authors, that was just one of 5 categories. That's the one that he responded to, but it does raise this question of what do you do with all of this other stuff? This evidence was presented primarily in this video that references archaeology and enemy witnesses. If you haven't watched it, I really do recommend taking a look at it. To give a brief overview of it, some of this evidence is authors who are writing shortly after the time of the First Council of Nicaea, shortly after 325 AD, and are talking about things that happened before that. Eusebius here is a very important source. He speaks of honorific portrait images of Christ and the apostles and traces them back to apostolic times. He also speaks of a trophy memorial statue of Christ set up by the woman with the issue of blood from the Gospels. Now, both of these image types, the language that Eusebius uses to describe them makes it very clear that they fall into the intrinsically honorable category.
And I want to emphasize here, you don't have to believe in the historicity of the story that Eusebius gives of the origin of this trophy memorial statue. I mean, I exercise deference to tradition, but in order to follow this argument, you don't have to affirm that. However, if Eusebius believed that it was that ancient, it's very unlikely that this practice started 5 minutes before he wrote. And it's very unlikely that this was the result of external imposition on the church.
And it did not start 5 minutes before he wrote either. So even though church history is written after the ascension of Constantine to the imperial throne, we know, and I'm glad you brought this up, Seraphim, we know for a fact that this image was being venerated well before 325 AD because of the targeted destruction of this image by the imperial government, by either Maximian or Maxentius, depending on which specific account you pick. The names are similar, so, of course, people are going to get them confused. But there was an imperial program of destroying Jewish and Christian holy sites that several emperors adopted. The destruction of that statue at Paneas therefore indicates its sacral status, the fact that it was actually a site of pilgrimage and veneration.
And this is important, I really think, because Dr. Ortlund says that in the pre-Nicene period, one of the things that distinguishes Christians from pagans, and one of the reasons that pagans criticize Christians, is that, in his presentation of the history, Christians do not have images and pagans do. However, if this was a widely recognized point of distinction which set paganism and Christianity apart, why are the pagan emperors targeting Christian images? And if this is a controversial practice, which is accreted from a paganism, I want to know where the controversy is. You maybe can point to the disputed passages in Epiphanius. However, if this is a distinct mark of being a Christian in those early centuries, and there are things like this statue around to which people are making pilgrimage, and it's a historical fact that they are there, then where is the controversy you would expect if, in fact, this played the role that Dr. Ortlund says it did in setting the church apart from its pagan counterparts?
Yep. And before we move on, I think it's really important to note the acclaim that Eusebius himself has as a source, his generally acknowledged credibility. And to quote Dr. Ortlund, Eusebius is the father of church history. His knowledge of the church in its early history is second to none. So very important to consider him as an actual source of evidence, Eusebius. There's also two pre-Nicene martyr accounts that were written after 325 AD, but that reference martyrs who died before 325 AD. And in their martyr accounts are described as bowing to icons of Christ and the saints. This was brought up in the video that I just mentioned, but very important to consider that evidence as well. Now, there were also several instances of enemy or hostile attestation, which we considered from Jewish, Roman, and Gnostic sources. Two of the most interesting ones are from the Gnostic Acts of John, which is arguably, it's probably a second, if not early 3rd century document, which has a very strange episode in which basically you have what looks like Gnostics complaining about the Orthodox following the practice and theology, like the theology of, not just the practice, of Second Nicaea. And the joke that I made on the Transfigured Life channel was, what are we going to say? Time-traveling Gnostics? Like, in order to explain this, you have to give an account for why this was being targeted and responded to at such length, why the way that icon veneration is presented there seems to have layers of depth to it, if it wasn't actually a real practice happening on the ground. The other really, I think all of these are good arguments from enemy attestation, but the other one that's really compelling and I think a bit of an eye-opener for people is the Alexamenos graffito, which people do interpret this as a reference, as a pagan mockery of Christian image-making practices and or image veneration practices. The scholar Felicity Harley is particularly interesting in this regard. She notes that it's hard to explain why this would come into existence in the late 100s or early 200s when it was probably made, if there wasn't some kind of a visual component to Christian practice related to the cross. Another piece of evidence that it needs to be part of the overall explanation of the ante-Nicene period, that there's such a consistent, seems to be so many consistent statements by the enemies of Christianity that they venerate crosses and portrait icons. You could say that it's all just concocted out of their minds, that it's just slander, but the problem then is it starts to sound a little conspiratorial.
If you enjoy this content, please consider supporting this channel as a patron or paid Substack subscriber. I post reflections on scripture 6 days a week, and 3 of these posts are exclusive to those who are patrons or paid subscribers on Substack at $5 per month. At $10 per month, patrons have access both to all of my written content as well as to weekly exclusive videos of about a half hour per week. At $30 per month, patrons have access to all of the preceding as well as a weekly class on the Old Testament of about an hour to an hour and a half each. Finally, at $35 per month, patrons receive access to all of my written and recorded exclusive content, as well as the ability to schedule monthly calls of 1 hour every month as long as you remain a patron at this level. You can also access these benefits through channel memberships on YouTube. Please also consider purchasing my lecture sets, Answering Protestantism from the Bible, 17 hours, and Answering Calvinism from the Bible, 6.5 hours. These can be purchased either individually or together for a discount. All links are in the description box and pinned comment. Your support, both financially and especially through your daily prayers, is what enables me to produce regular, high-quality, and original content. Thank you so much.
There were also numerous archaeological and epigraphical evidences which we considered. Here are some examples. Part of what we need to consider here is when it looks like acts of veneration are being depicted towards images. So you'll see stuff that appears like that in the 2 images in the left column. Also, all of the images of the cross that you see on here appear to depict processions with a crucifix. These images of the cross on here, sometimes they are dated to before 325 AD, but even if they are from the period immediately following, like 350 AD, Felicity Harley still notes that you need a prototype image to explain why there would be 2 of these and why they would be so similar to the Alexamenos graffito, for instance, in their visual form. So this all it has to be taken into account as well.
And I really love that point in particular, because one of the things that I say in engaging with
skeptics or people who have maybe something like Bart Ehrman's portrait of the early church is that there is a great deal of evidence that the early churches were networked together in a really robust way. So, for example, Larry Hurtado, who actually comes into the discussion of iconography in interesting ways, Larry Hurtado has pointed out that there is a consistent Christian set of scribal practices going back to the early centuries. And that's very unlikely if the Christian community in Alexandria is really not in close contact with the Christian community in Rome, and they believe very different things, or two different kinds of Christianities, and one of them was made Orthodox later in history. But what this evidence suggests is that that point about scribal practices also applies to image culture. There appears to be a distinctly Christian visual culture, and it really requires, in my opinion, special pleading to say that you can't describe this as iconography. I mean, look at the screen and look at the things that you see. What would you call that image if you saw it in an Orthodox church? You would call it an icon. And we're not saying that there's no possible way you can meet the burden, but if you want to make an argument that this isn't an icon, you need to give an explanation for why that is. And then I just want to reiterate the point that the idea that these were made but not venerated does not save or vindicate Gavin's presentation, because that's not the only claim that he made in his videos. The claim that he made in his videos was that the early Christians make statements which indicate that this kind of visual art was entirely absent from the churches. The passages that he quote do not say that images were made, but they weren't venerated. To use some of his language, they could have said that. That's a way they could have responded to a pagan argument. We make these, yes. We have images of the cross. We have images of Christ. We don't revere them. But they don't say that. But the passages Gavin quoted say, we do not have images. And if, in fact, these did exist, that suggests that what they're talking about isn't what we would call icons.
I also pointed to several pre-Nicene paintings. I go much more in depth about this in the book, but the art of the catacombs and Dura Europos, I think even when you look at it, there are certain things about it that suggest cultic use. It's widely acknowledged that this kind of structure that you see here on the screen in all three of these religious buildings from that city, probably made by the same architectural and construction firm, by the way, to the extent that such things existed in the ancient world. All three of these kind of shrine structures are very distinctly marked out as having the purpose of kind of concentrating your attention on what is underneath the kind of extended arch that sort of juts out at the viewer. The columns, the arch shape, the image underneath, it all follows a common Roman form that you see in the lararium in the Roman household as well, which is basically, this is the stuff we venerate. This is the stuff we venerate. And the specific image that's there underneath the baptismal font at Dura Europos is an image of Christ as the Good Shepherd. This is also very significant when you start to look at the catacombs, because you see there on the left a depiction of Christ as the Good Shepherd in the vault of this arcosolium in this catacomb. He's being depicted as being prayed to by multiple figures within this image. This idea of images having a devotional use or being, quote, prayed through, unquote. I think it's something that you have to look at the formal qualities of these images. You have to look at their context, how they're positioned in relation to other images, such as in this case, there's sub-images beneath the Good Shepherd. And you have to think about architectural and archaeological comparanda as well. When you do, it's kind of hard to just say, this is just a decoration. That certainly isn't what's naturally suggested to the scholars who survey this evidence.
I think, many people will say that this archaeological evidence does not demonstrate the way that people behaved in relation to it. But obviously, we don't have a video recording. The question I would put to such people is, are there any criteria by which we might meaningfully assess the question of how people interacted with these images, if they did at all? And I think it's very difficult to seriously argue that there are no ways that you can ask that question or put that question to the data that's at hand. If you excavate, for example, a building where there are a ring of chairs, and then at the front of the building, there is one particular chair which is elevated above the rest with a pathway leading towards that chair, it would be ridiculous to say that you can't make inferences about the unique authority of the person who sat in that chair or about the way that people approaching that chair interacted with it, right? The structure of architecture and the role that images play within an architectural structure obviously give you information about the way people were likely to interact with it. Yes, they're probabilistic judgments. We recognize that. But this is what history is about. History is not susceptible to these snappy, quick statements where we can just read a few texts, with all respect to Dr. Ortlund, say, look, this is so clear. There are a complex, there's a complex group of evidence, and it has to be considered in relation to each other.
Yeah. And in terms of the criteria with which one can approach this and make an educated probabilistic judgment about whether or not something was venerated, I do go in depth into formal qualities, the context of an image, and its comparanda. I apply those criteria to these three categories of pre-Nicene Christian images, namely orant images, images of the Good Shepherd, and then this little icon of Christ and the Theotokos that you see on the right here. And I think it's in the application of those criteria, it's hard to walk away from applying them and just say, yeah, I mean, like, who knows? We have no idea if it was venerated. So yeah, it definitely makes it more likely when you approach it that way. There's a sixth kind of evidence that I'm just going to go back to this really quick. Likely by the time that this video is published, Craig Truglia will have dropped his massive visual presentation of the material culture evidence for the creation and veneration of holy images from Old Testament times all the way up to the Ante-Nicene period. Definitely worth a look. I strongly recommend that people look in there. You'll see some of my influence in there as well. But it turns out that there's just quite a lot of reason for thinking that Jews and then Christians had holy images that they interacted with in a ritual way from the early days. I also appeared on the Transfigured Life channel about 6 months ago or so and presented some new evidence that I have been kind of keeping quiet for a while about the pre-Nicene teachings about holy symbolic images from the Old Testament and how this reflects their veneration. I strongly recommend people go ahead and take a look at that video. Anyone who's kind of confused about what to do with the bronze serpent incident from the scriptures, I think that this will be a big eye-opener for you. And you'll get to see some potentially first century apostolic era type evidence that this was understood as a holy image, a predecessor to the Holy Cross. And so going into now Dr. Ortlund's objections to our case, we want to again just note this was a cumulative case. There's multiple lines of evidence. We're happy to respond to his critique of the written evidence from before 325 AD, but there's other stuff sitting out there for people to consider as well.
And the other stuff feeds back into the way that you take the written evidence, right? Yeah. And I think this is one of the flaws in Dr. Ortlund's presentation, which is that he takes these passages and he treats them individually as if the other passages don't really exist, and more importantly in this context, as if this other kind of evidence doesn't exist, right? So if we just had that letter from Ignatius, and that was it, I would say, no, this is not a good argument for the presence of early veneration of images. However, when you have strong visual representations that we have excavated in the ground, evidence that people were behaving ritually in relation to images of the cross, and you combine that with the significance of the language that Ignatius uses in that particular culture, then it starts to shift the burden of proof onto the person who wants to say that, in fact, Ignatius would have been more close to the iconoclastic position than to the iconophile position. And so these pieces of evidence, they feed into each other and they relate in a complex way. And, naturally, it's difficult to really do justice to that in video presentations. And that's why I want to emphasize to folks, from whatever perspective, these aren't simple issues. And I credit Dr. Ortlund with, challenging folks who maybe just want to jump on the Orthodox or Catholic bandwagon without really working through these issues, that, these are complicated things. We need to go through an intellectual ascesis, as it were, and work through these and treat these issues with the gravity that they deserve. And I think we all really need to strive to meet that challenge.
Yeah, agreed. By way of response, we're going to have 6 sections here where we take on this video. First, we'll look at what Dr. Ortlund's 6 objections are. Then we'll reply kind of all at once to the first 3 objections by simply restating our original project. What were we actually trying to do in the first place? Thirdly, we'll give a kind of general reply to objections 4, 5, and 6, but they have application to particular authors as well in different cases. And so that's what we'll do in sections 4 and 5, is defend the claim that there's making and venerating of images in St. Ignatius and Clement, then in Origen, Tertullian, and St. Methodius. And then there's some kind of concluding notes that we can go over at the end as we interact also with how Dr. Ortlund finished off his video. So to begin, Dr. Ortlund's own 6 objections. This is our attempt to summarize them. So first, that none of the arguments given in our presentation of the written evidence show that everything Second Nicaea taught regarding images and their veneration is true. Secondly, that no justification has been given for the anathemas of Second Nicaea. Thirdly, that the anathemas make it so that the only way to vindicate Second Nicaea is to show its teachings and practices were fully formed from the beginning. Fourthly, that reasoning from how pagans use their images to how Christians use their images is illegitimate. Fifthly, that those aren't icons in the 5 examples of pre-Nicene written sources that we bring up. And lastly, that's not veneration in the examples of pre-Nicene written sources we bring up. So to respond to his first 3 objections, we'd like to just set the record straight on how this all began, so to speak. So the goal of our project was to respond to Gavin's original video from January 2023 and refute its key claim. And that claim is that there was no image veneration in the pre-Nicene church. He says other things as well, that it was rejected in a resounding and unanimous way. But I think the key claim is that there was none. Because obviously, if there was some, then it wasn't rejected. So this is what I'm going to say is the key claim. And the rest of his case really kind of follows from it. The councils and the anathemas, so on and so forth, those concerns seem to only really have force for the most part if there's this innovation going on, if there's this doctrinal U-turn that he alleges. And to be fair to him, there's to acknowledge the rhetorical forcefulness of his original video, it is true that if this key claim is true, it's hard to square with orthodoxy. And it's no wonder that therefore people kind of look at his video as like kind of a go-to Protestant video online. However, if good evidence exists for at least some veneration of images, even one instance in the ante-Nicene church, then the key claim is false. Counter
folks, because I have a feeling people are going to misunderstand this. Saying that there's one instance of image veneration in the pre-Nicene period, we're not saying that proves Second Nicaea. We're just saying that Dr. Ortlund's claim is false here. And so part of this is to encourage Dr. Ortlund to state his position in a more precise fashion. It's not as punchy, but it's more accurate.
Yeah. So one counterexample here, if there is only one, it would refute this universal negative claim that there's no veneration. However, what we're actually putting forward is 5 written evidences and then about 16 other kinds of evidence. So that's like 21 counterexamples. In order for his key claim to really hold, what has to actually be the case is that none of those counterexamples are successful. So while it's worthwhile to give, a thorough defense of Second Nicaea, and it merits that defense, don't get me wrong, Dr. Ortlund was the one putting forward this claim of internal inconsistency to begin with, and the claim was about no image veneration in the pre-Nicene church. He claimed this was a contradiction. And it doesn't really make sense to move on to defending all the other aspects of Second Nicaea before settling, was the thing that Dr. Ortlund said in this original, now globally famous video, was it actually true? If it wasn't, then that's a serious problem for it. And I think that would change people's perception even of whether or not Second Nicaea is credible. And as it turns out, Dr. Ortlund's claim is not correct. There was image veneration in the pre-Nicene church. So overall, these first two objections, why didn't you defend everything in Second Nicaea, and where's the defense of the Anathemas? This doesn't really seem to be an actual refutation of our evidence. It's more of a restatement of his concerns about Second Nicaea. So it's not really a critique of our evidence. So next, there's this third objection that he offers about the Anathemas setting the bar. And so here we have a quote from the video that he did in response to us recently. So he says, I know some people are going to say, but Gavin, you don't have to have an exact reference to icon veneration. And I'm bracketing that what he means by that is as defined at Second Nicaea. Just something that is consistent with that and pushes toward that. And he says, but that's why I went through Second Nicaea. Again, the Anathemas there set the bar. That's why I tried to say, this is setting the table for the discussion. They are making the claims. We're allowed to let those claims be taken at face value, but they don't get anywhere near that. So we're not just a little bit off here. So that they don't get anywhere near that. By that, what he means is the evidence we put forward, he alleges that it's not even approximately like image veneration. Okay, so what should we make of this objection? Well, I thought it was a very interesting one. This demand for precise wording, though, that the things be kind of present in an exact manner before, as opposed to the content being there, but it being formulated somewhat differently. I think this actually is shooting oneself in the foot. This is because setting this standard of evidence this high creates problems for defending things like traditional biblical morality. This is how revisionists about these matters argue. They say, yes, St. Paul criticizes certain kinds of sexual relationships which existed at that time, but where does he explicitly rule out consensual same-sex relationships? It's unfair to hold people to a standard that wasn't explicit early on. But St. Paul doesn't have to describe every specific thing he's speaking against in order for him to actually declare that certain things should or should not be the case. Neither does Second Nicaea have to be based on finding every single mode of veneration present early on. So it's not unfair to hold people to the actual correct interpretation of biblical sexual morality just because not every potential marginal case is attested to and mentioned. So similarly, with Second Nicaea, just because not every mode of veneration may not be present early on, that wouldn't imply that veneration itself isn't. That wouldn't imply that the theology itself isn't there. And to give an example that illustrates this, consider the First Ecumenical Council. Consider First Nicaea. As we look at it, it becomes clear that this isn't what ecumenical councils are for. They're not for just a simple restatement of exactly what has been said before or a reaffirmation of existing practice. That's not what they are. To understand why, think about the Anathemas, First Nicaea issues against those who do not confess Christ is of one essence with the Father, homoousios. That specific word was not a strong, widely accepted part of the tradition up to that point. Frankly, there were people, there were Gnostic and modalist heretics that actually used that language before. But that doesn't mean the council was wrong. It was offering a new formulation to defend the same doctrinal content that was there from day one, the doctrine of the Trinity, there in the Bible, but with language that was updated to be more precise against the heresy of Arianism. And so we can say the same thing about Second Nicaea. The prototype theology that the honor given to the image passes to the prototype, and the practice of having holy images and venerating them, it is there in the early church. Second Nicaea is therefore giving that practice a more concrete form to combat a heresy, iconoclasm. So in sum, all you need is to have the same content of the faith in order for this to work, in order for a council to be legitimate. It's defending the content and offering a new binding form. The way this gets formulated into wording of teaching and specific features of practices can be changed. The whole point of a council is to give a new formulation for that. So this kind of objection just doesn't work. And frankly, it expresses a mindset that's foreign to the spirit of the early church and the councils. So this demand for precise precedent, it's, to be honest, it would basically cancel all councils. That's like really what it would do. This project that we originally began, it was to refute the claim that there was no image veneration early on. Everything else follows from this. And so, again, to go back to what we were saying before, if we can show one example of image veneration early on, then the case is intact, and it's a vindication of the claim that, yes, there was veneration of images early on. So now moving into Dr. Ortlund's objections 4, 5, and 6. His objection 4 is that you can't derive how Christians used images from how pagans used images. And when you first hear this, it sounds pretty credible. It's like, yeah, well, Christians wouldn't be idolaters, right? But it's actually not that simple, because pagans, Romans, that is to say, they used images in a variety of ways, some of which were not idolatrous. And so, to be clear, the claim is not that Christians borrowed from the Roman culture idols of pagan gods or the practice of idolatry. That is to say, the specific practicing of offering sacrifices of food or incense to cult statues, which were believed to be alive, and which you thought you were feeding, and increasing their bodily presence in the world by providing this nutrition to them. We're not saying that Christians did that. In fact, they very clearly and obviously reject that. That's a very specific practice. And it's really different from the kind of honor that you show to like the American flag by putting your hand over your heart or standing for it or singing a song to it and about it. One is worship, and the other, in the case of the flag, those are modes of veneration. And we can all clearly see that. So here's the claim we are making, that Roman Christians baptized certain kinds of non-idolatrous images and ceremonial practices. They Christianized their culture. And this involved adopting and adapting images that were commonly venerated, not worshipped in the Roman world. The way Gavin kind of talks about this in his video, it comes up 2 times in relation to the signet rings that Clement references and Pliny the Elder's attestation to how they were used. And it also comes up in relation to the ritual cups that Tertullian references. The way Gavin talks about this question in the video, it kind of suggests that Christians would not adopt and modify even non-idolatrous Roman art. But we know for a fact that they actually did do this. This is utterly clear when you consider the pre-Nicene Christian representation of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. It's very obvious that in terms of its motifs and some, basic stylistic features of it, it's an adaptation and a baptizing of a pre-existing Greco-Roman image type, namely the Kiophorus or ram bearer image. And awkwardly, for those that want to say that Christians just had this allergy to anything that even remotely resembled paganism, that image was a way of representing the guardian spirits of the household, or more commonly, the god Mercury in the Roman world, the shepherd of souls to the underworld. Christians, they took this motif, they made modifications, and they turned it into their own image of the Good Shepherd, but it very clearly has this kind of prehistory in the Roman world, before its baptizing and before the removal of the connection to false gods and to practices of immorality and to things like idolatry. You also might think that the way that Dr. Ortlund is speaking, that Christians would never have adopted any kind of Roman ceremonial practices, but the problem is they did do this as well. For example, Roman type votive inscriptions or dedicatory inscriptions, which were used to consecrate a building or an object as holy to a deity. These are not uncommon in early Christian churches, such as even the Megiddo Church in the Holy Land has this. That inscription there, the dedicatory inscription for the altar there reads, "The God-loving Akeptos offers the table to God Jesus Christ." Very clearly not dedicating it to a pagan god, just to Christ, but that way of formulating the idea of dedication or votive, it's cookie cutter Roman wording, the way that it's worded. By the way, this mosaic, the floor mosaic that has these inscriptions, is now touring in America. It's at the Museum of the Bible in, I believe, Washington, D.C. Very, very interesting inscription. It's basically dedicating an early Christian altar to be used in Eucharistic worship. There's also a mosaic of fishes that's present next to this inscription. Very significant, interesting stuff. I have my own thoughts about exactly how to interpret all of this that I hope to share with people at some point, but it's important to realize how much crossover there is, how much baptizing of the culture was being done by Christians at this time. And so
this is, I think, just an important broad level point here, is that when early Christians are saying, we don't have images like you have images, there's already within the Roman context a wide variety of different kinds of images, right? Nobody is going to completely eliminate any kind of visual representation or say that all kinds of visual representation are idolatrous. So in view of certain kinds of this archaeological evidence, as well as the textual evidence that's been cited, a reasonable prima facie interpretation of many of these passages, which sound at first glance like they are iconoclastic, is to interpret them as referring not even to all Roman images, but specifically to those kinds of images that are under discussion, which are those images which are part of an idolatrous liturgical pattern of life.
Yep. Exactly. Now, on the other hand, what you notice with Christians is that they adopted a variety of image types from the Roman world and some Roman ceremonial practices while steering clear of idolatry. But many of these image types that they adopted had a culturally set ceremonial practice that was like associated with them, namely veneration. We can call these kinds of images which Christians adopted intrinsically honorable images. Some examples are things like battle standards, signet rings, ritual cups, and honorific portraits. These intrinsically honorable image types are, by cultural definition, the kinds of images that have veneration practices attached to them. So if you discover one of them in an archaeological find, you automatically have evidence that image veneration occurred at that place, because that's the kind of image that's there. It's the venerated kind. And so if you notice a community using these intrinsically honorable image types, it's therefore safe to assume they venerated such images in the absence of clear contrary evidence. Creates a prima facie, a really strong prima facie reason for thinking, yeah, this was venerated because it's here in the first place. The person who flatly denies they were venerated without any evidence that they weren't is kind of like the person who's given like conclusive evidence that some object is a walking stick, and then they kind of say, well, we just don't know. Maybe it was only used for typing, like at a distance. You kind of like type from a distance with it, or maybe stirring soup. Maybe the walking stick was just a large toothpick. Like the fact that it's a walking stick could be any number of uses implied. No,
if you're coming out of this culture and you have a kind of object which everybody uses in a specific way, in a specific pattern, and then you come into the church and they have those same kinds of objects, you are going to use them in the same way unless somebody tells you to use them differently. So it's possible people did say use them differently, but there should be evidence about that because the early Christians talk about images and the different ways in which they are used. So our challenge to Gavin and to those who would follow his thesis here is to show that evidence, because we know there are kinds of visual representations that are used in the early centuries. That's not open to dispute. The question is, why do you think that they were not used in the way that people were culturally conditioned to use these images?
Yep. And so we actually can make solid inferences from the fact that Christians borrowed and adapted image types that had a culturally set ceremonial practice of veneration. And so when we see Christians using battle standards, signet ring images, ritual cups, honorific portraits, the burden of proof, it's on the person who wants to deny these images weren't venerated. And so, that's kind of where things stand when we see examples in St. Ignatius, Clement, and Tertullian. Even if we couldn't show that a gesture of veneration is being done, even if we couldn't show that, although I think we can, you'd still have to face up to the fact that this is the kind of image that was venerated. And that affects also how we should read apparent evidence of a gesture. It increases the prior probability that what you're looking at is, in fact, a gesture of veneration. Now, another preliminary issue that I think, Seraphim, you wanted to talk about this is this this connection between making and venerating.
If you enjoy this content, please consider supporting this channel as a patron or paid Substack subscriber. I post reflections on Scripture 6 days a week, and 3 of these posts are exclusive to those who are patrons or paid subscribers on Substack at $5 per month. At $10 per month, patrons have access both to all of my written content as well as to weekly exclusive videos of about a half hour per week. At $30 per month, patrons have access to all of the preceding as well as a weekly class on the Old Testament of about an hour to an hour and a half each. Finally, at $35 per month, patrons receive access to all of my written and recorded exclusive content, as well as the ability to schedule monthly calls of 1 hour every month as long as you remain a patron at this level. You can also access these benefits through channel memberships on YouTube. Please also consider purchasing my lecture sets, Answering Protestantism from the Bible, 17 hours, and Answering Calvinism from the Bible, 6.5 hours. These can be purchased either individually or together for a discount. All links are in the description box and pinned comment. Your support, both financially and especially through your daily prayers, is what enables me to produce regular, high quality, and original content. Thank you so much.